Hello, today I'll be trying to replicate the first Korean movable metal type, except without a forge and also on a college student budget. But before we can jump into making the type, let's go over some history first. About 50 years before Gutenberg created his movable metal type, Korea had created their own. Before their invention, the Chinese woodblock printing method was a favored technique for mass-producing texts. However, Korea soon ran into multiple problems when it came to books. For one, the palace where most of the texts were kept were burnt down not just once, but twice, leaving thousands of texts to be permanently erased from history. Secondly, a war taking place in China prevented Korea from importing books. And thirdly, Korea lacked a quality source of wood to make their own woodcut and wood type. Though they didn't have any wood, they did have a surplus of bronze and already developed a metal casting technique they used to mint coins. So this allowed for a perfect storm of sorts to start making their own metal type. So how did they make it, you may ask? Well, the metal casting process for the movable type was described as the following by a Korean scholar of that era. At first, one cuts letters into beech wood. One fills a trough level with fine sandy clay of the reed-growing seashore. Wood-cut letters are pressed into the sand. Then the impressions become negative and form letter molds. At this step, placing one trough together with another, one pours the molten bronze down into an opening. The fluid flows in, filling these negative molds, one by one becoming type. Lastly, one scrapes and files off the irregularities and piles them up to be arranged. And so the end result looks something like this. Wait, hold up. You might be looking at this and thinking to yourself, hey, that's not Korean, that's Chinese. And you would be correct. This is because Korean movable metal type was invented in the 13th century, while Korea was still using Chinese characters. It wasn't until the 14th century that Korean developed their own alphabet in hopes to improve literacy. Seeing that I do not have a forge for melting bronze, nor do I have the money to buy the troughs and the sand clay, I had to get creative in finding substitutions. In place of bronze, I will be using plaster to cast the letters. Since the letters are pretty thin, I will be using an embroidery circle instead of proper troughs used in metal casting. And instead of buying forgery quality casting sand, I will be using a childhood favorite of mine, kinetic sand. As with any project, I ran into some minor problems. Thankfully, these were easy to fix. For example, when picking out kinetic sand, I originally went with one labeled beach sand, figuring it might be closer to what they used back then. However, it was way too coarse, so I switched back to original kinetic sand, which is much finer. Also, I found that kinetic sand would not stick to the trough frame, which is essential for getting those uniform flat backs. So I would have to find another way to cast the letters without using a top trough. During my first attempts at casting, I found that the letter impressions were too shallow. So to hopefully fix this, I went back to my wood blocks and filed down the areas surrounding the letters even further. And that brings us to now. Will my corrections work, or will they fail? It's time to find out! To begin, I first traced out the letters onto blank Scrabble pieces. Instead of a traditional Korean text, I chose to write some inspirational quote from a BTS song. Then, with an outline to reference, I used my hand drill to shave down the areas around the letters. This way, the lettering is the tallest and is the only part that will get covered with ink. Now that the woodblock cuttings are done, it's time to prepare the trough. Step 1 is to put sand in the trough. Step 2, pack the sand tight. Step 3, level the sand. Step 4, press letters into the sand and gently remove them. Step 5, mix plaster and place them in the molds. Step 6, now this is where things start to get a bit different than the traditional process. Because we cannot use a top trough, I had to find another way to make sure the backs would stay flat. During my testing phase, I found that a silicone mat with a flat weighted top works perfectly fine. Now all we have to do is wait for the plaster to dry. After 45 minutes, it's time to remove our letters from the sand. As you can see, the kinetic sand is a bit sticky, so I have to dust off the remaining sand with a paintbrush. I then place them in my windowsill to ensure they are fully dry before I clean them for a second time. This time, more forcefully with an old electric toothbrush. And to make sure ink doesn't immediately absorb into the plaster, I give them a quick spray of Mod Podge Sealer. And when all that's finally done, ta-da! We have our casted letters. Things are looking pretty okay at this point. Compared to past tests, the edges are more defined, and the letters are pretty easy to see. But we're not done yet. After all, we haven't even printed yet. Traditional Korean metal type is placed on a lined board and filled in with beeswax to keep the letters in place. But because the board I have doesn't have grooves to hold wax, I will be using Crayola, air dry clay, to keep the letters in place. Finally, I take an ink pad and press them on the letters, and press a paper firmly against the board. And now it's time to see the final results. Drum roll, please. And it barely worked. I tried doing it again with normal printer paper and then also using paint instead of ink, and the results were different, but not necessarily in a good way. If I had to grade it, I would give myself a 3 out of 10. I left some impression, but the letters aren't very easy to read, not to mention I accidentally placed some of the letters upside down. But overall, I'm okay with this. It may not have turned out well, but I still learned a lot about Korean movable metal type. And also, failure isn't something you necessarily need to fear. It's basically a stepping stone to success. So this is where my video ends. Thank you so much for watching. And if you decide to try this at home, I hope you have better results than I did. Bye!